that's a little bit about Ron. You get a sense of who Ron is. Let's move to Denver, our dear Denver that we just lost on March 31st. So Denver is one of the more complex characters in this book. Denver grew up in the deep South in Louisiana. He was a poor black child born in the 50s in Red River Parish, Louisiana. Any thoughts that he might have had about all men being created equal were quickly destroyed at about the time he was 15 or 16 years old, when he stopped to help a white woman change a flat tire. And I'm going to read from page 2 of the book. This comes very early in the book as you learn about Denver. He says that he stopped and he saw a white woman with a flat tire, and he asked if she needed help, and she said she did. I asked her, did she have a jack? And she said she did. Well, about that time, and for any of you who have read this book, Ron's dialect comes through in his writing. It says, well, about that time, I got the tire fixed. Here come 3 white boys riding out of the woods on bay horses. They'd been hunting, I think, and they'd come trotting up and didn't see me because I was on the road and I ducked down fixing the tire on the side of the car. Red dust from the horses' tracks floated up over me. First I got still, thinking I'd wait for him to go by. Then I decided I didn't want him to think I was hiding, so I started to stand up. Right then, one of them asked the white lady, did she need any help? I reckon not, a red-headed fellow with big teeth said when he spotted me. She's got a nigger helping her. Another one, dark-haired and kind of weaselly looking, put one hand on his saddle horn, pushed back his hat, and said, boy, what you doing bothering this nice lady? He wasn't nothing but a boy himself, maybe 18, 19 years old. I didn't say nothing. I just looked at him. What you looking at, boy? He said. The other 2 just laughed. The white lady didn't say nothing, looking down at her shoes. Except for the horses shuffling, things got real quiet. Like the yellow spell before a cyclone. Then the boy closest to me slung a grass rope around my neck, like he was roping a calf. He jerked it tight, cutting off my breath. The noose poked into my neck like burrs, and fear crawled up through my legs and into my belly. I caught a look at all 3 of them boys, and I remembered thinking none of them was much older than me, but their eyes got flat and mean. We got to teach you a lesson about bothering white ladies, said the one holding a rope. That was the last thing them boys said to me. And then Denver goes on to say that he doesn't want to recount what happened after that moment. But you can see he's learned a really terrible lesson early in his life about what happens when you stop to help somebody. In his mind, this is what happens. And I think that plays out in the story a little later when he meets Deborah or Debbie. Denver worked in the cotton fields in Louisiana for about 30 years. His life was filled with some family that loved him. He worked very hard. He had a little white friend by the name of Bobby, and they were considered partners in crime. That's what they called each other. One of the most touching and stirring, there's so many touching stories in this book. I mean, it's just one page after another. But one that was really great was when Denver was a teenager with Bobby. They worked for the Man in the summer. You don't know who the Man is. He was just called the Man. And they would pick the after pieces of cotton, bundle them up, and take them to the Man. And all summer long, the Man would tell them they didn't have enough cotton to get any money for it. But they kept picking these little pieces of cotton and taking them to the Man. Well, what Denver didn't know was that Bobby had told the Man that Denver really wanted a bike, because Bobby had a bike, but Denver didn't have a bike. So at the end of the summer, when Denver took his last load of cotton in, what was waiting for him? A bright red Schwinn bicycle. The Man had gotten him the bicycle, which surprised Denver, and I think redeemed some relationships that were really important. It's a really lovely story to read. Denver lived for a time with his grandmother and his grandfather called Big Mama and Papa. And one of the most sad and graphic stories that I won't read today in the book is about the fire at his grandparents' house and how his Big Mama, grandmother, was stuck in the house. And he could hear her screaming but couldn't get to her. And the house burned down, and Big Mama died in the house. And I think if you really, and I'm a psychologist by trade, so I look at everything through that lens, but you look at Denver's life starting to spiral, I think it started then by great loss of those that he loved from a young age. But then he had the opportunity to go live with his aunt and uncle. And even though they were great and wonderful to him, his life started to spiral a little out of control. Poverty, oppression started to affect him. And the desperation of his situation, he committed 2 robberies. He turned himself in, and he was actually sentenced to 20 years in Angola prison. He actually only served 10. When he left prison, he remembered the words of his cousin, who said that trains could take you anywhere to any dream that you had. And so sure enough, Denver had nothing to lose, and he hopped a train and left Louisiana, and the first stop was in Fort Worth, Texas. There, Denver learned the profession of homelessness, and I do mean profession, actually, and he speaks very clearly about it. Excuse me while I get on my ebook here. And this is what he says about learning how to be a professional homeless person. He says, let me see if I, oh my goodness, I think I've written down the wrong page on this. I apologize. Oh. I've lost it. I apologize. Oh, it's page 71. I apologize. If you have your book, it is on page 71. So this is what, oh, you know, you really just need the paper. Whoever said anybody should have ebooks, particularly for this. I apologize, everything's going crazy. Okay, so here's how he learned to be a professional homeless person. Because he'd never been homeless before. This is what he learned. He says, he'd go to the part of town where smart people worked, the kind that wore a coat and tie. Some of them gentlemen, they'd give you $1 right out of the gate if you just made it look like you were hungry enough. Some of them would give it to you quickly, though, so you'd have to hurry up and get out of their face so they wouldn't smell you too long. But other folks seemed like they really wanted to help. They'd look you in the eye and maybe even smile. I kind of felt bad hustling $1 off a person like that. So I could pull off something called the hamburger drop. And I have to tell you, I've never heard, somebody knows the hamburger drop. I'd never heard of the hamburger drop. Anyhow, here's how the hamburger drop worked. After I'd get my $1 for that day, I'd go down to McDonald's and buy a hamburger, take a couple bites out of it, wrap it back up. Then I'd pick me out one of them big, tall office buildings that had a trash can on the sidewalk right out in front. When nobody was looking, I'd stick that wrapped up hamburger down in the can and I'd wait. Soon as I saw somebody coming, I'd pretend like I was digging through the trash. Then I'd come up with the hamburger and commence to eating it. For sure, always somebody was going to stop and say, "Hey, don't eat that." And then they're going to give you some money because they think you eating out of a garbage can. They feel real sorry for you, but they don't know it's your garbage that you done put in that can in the first place. So there you go. It really talks about the cleverness, and I can tell you, having worked with the homeless, it is a matter of survival, and they become very, very clever. I never knew about a hamburger drop before. Now I have another one in my arsenal. I thought that was very interesting. But it also talks about how clever Denver is. And we're going to talk in a little bit about the wisdom of Denver more, because truly of the 3 characters in this book, although they are all wise, Denver is perhaps the most wise in the book. So we're going to leave Denver here for a minute and talk just briefly about Debbie, because you get a glimpse of Debbie, but you don't get the background and kind of the meat of Debbie, because this is written in third person. Denver and Ron are writing about Debbie. But Ron writes the Debbie story. Debbie grew up in Snyder, a tumbleweed-tossed West Texas town, so flat you could stand on a cow chip and see New Mexico. Anybody know where Snyder is? I don't. It's in West Texas someplace? Okay. Yeah. Debbie was one of twin sisters. Her sister Gretchen was supposedly the beautiful one, although I've seen pictures of Debbie and I think she's quite beautiful. Debbie was considered the bookworm and, quote, neat as a preacher's wife on Sunday. So you can kind of get an image of Debbie in your mind. I think what you read about Debbie as you read through the stories of Debbie is her great humility in everything she does. It's interesting hearing the, if you will, conversion experience of Debbie and Ron. They were what you'd call Christmas and Easter Christians. They kind of talked the talk. They weren't really walking the walk. And they were invited to go to somebody's house where they were confronted about truly committing their lives to Christ. And the book talks about, which I found quite interesting, that Ron was the first to take the host up on this new commitment towards Christ. Debbie, on the other hand, was a little slower on the uptake on this because she decided, they called her somewhat like an attorney. She was going to research this whole thing and determine whether she really wanted to commit her life to Christ, which she did. And it was her recommitting her life to Christ that made all the rest of this book possible. I think it really made the rest of this book possible. She was not only talking the talk, but she began to walk the walk. And that's what happened here. Debbie was a bit of a visionary. Both Debbie and Denver had dreams. They actually felt that they heard from God, and actually in this book it seems that they did. So once Debbie had her conversion experience, she told Ron that she had a dream about this man that she saw who, from a quote from Ecclesiastes, he was very wise, a very wise man. She could see him, his face. And he had the wisdom of Solomon. So Debbie says to Ron one day, so I think we should go down and serve food at the Union Rescue Gospel Mission. So Ron, one of the things I didn't talk about with Ron was Ron had a bit of a prejudice toward homeless folks, which, considering an experience he had, is not unusual, I guess. He had an art gallery in Fort Worth, and he had a couple of homeless folks that stopped in and talked with him. And they said, you know, Mister, how much is that painting on the wall? And he told them, and they had a discussion, and they left. And later they came back and burgled the store. So Ron didn't think too much about homeless folk. He had an experience that wasn't real positive. So what does Debbie say? Let's go down and serve meals at the Union Rescue Gospel Mission. Well, you know, Ron, being the good husband that he is, said, okay, I'll go with you. And I think he was very reticent at the time. And so they go to the Union Rescue Gospel Mission to serve meals. And this is an explanation of their first experience, if I can find it. Oh, goodness gracious. Okay, I'm going to move on from that, actually. I think what I really wanted to read to you is a little bit later. Okay, we'll get back to that. Sorry, I'm really going back to paper. So this is where I want to bring back the intertwining of the lives of Debbie and Ron and Denver and how they all come together. Very diverse people. You would never think that Denver's life would intertwine with this lovely white elementary school teacher and her very well-to-do husband from Fort Worth. And that's what makes this book so poignant. I'm going to have to try to find one of these pages here. So Denver and Debbie and her husband go to Union Rescue Gospel Mission to feed food. And what happens? They're in the line, and suddenly there's a scuffle. And this huge black man appears, and he's screaming, "I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill somebody." Well, what had happened was, it was Denver. And Denver scared everybody in the whole place. And somebody had stolen Denver's shoes. and Denver was out to get whoever had stolen his shoes. And it caused quite a ruckus, let's just put it that way, because Denver was a very big black man. And in the middle of the ruckus, Debbie looks at Ron and says, "That's him." And he looks at her and says, "That's who?" And she said, "That's the guy in my dream." Well, you can only imagine what Ron thought at that point. You know, the man who was as wise as Solomon is running in the door saying he's going to kill somebody because they've stolen his shoes. So I imagine it caused quite a ruckus. Denver's reaction to Debbie is quite wonderful. A couple weeks after the big ruckus, she's got her eye every Tuesday night on Denver. She's watching Denver come through because he's been in her dream and he is her calling. He is their calling, let's put it that way. And so she keeps looking for him. So finally, a couple weeks later, it says Denver's walking through the line, and Debbie walks out, stands right next to him, puts her skinny finger in his face, and tell me I'm not a bad fella. And the quote is, "Denver, God has a calling on your life." That's what Debbie said to him. And he says, this is what Denver says, "No matter how mean and how bad I tried to act at the mission, I couldn't shake that woman loose. She was the first person I met in a long time that wasn't scared of me. Seemed like to me she had spiritual eyes. She could see right through my skin to who I was on the inside." And I love that. I love the fact that he says that she could see through to who he was. And I think that when I talk at the end of this, one of the things I think that is very poignant about working with the homeless is you really can't judge that book by the cover. And that's what Denver is saying here. So Debbie makes this announcement to Denver that God's got plans for him. And then what does she do? She turns around to Ron, as any good woman would, and says, "All right, now you need to make friends with this guy. You need to become best friends." And Ron says, "Me?" She says, "Yep, you. You need to become best friends with this guy." So Ron takes Denver out for breakfast. And he tells Denver to pick Denver's favorite restaurant. Denver says he doesn't have a favorite restaurant because, quite frankly, he's never gone to a restaurant. So Ron takes Denver to a restaurant. And this is one of my favorite places in this book. So they're having breakfast, and Denver says to Ron, "Mind if I ask you a personal question?" "Of course not. Ask me anything you want." "I don't want to make you mad. You don't have to tell me nothing if you don't want to." "Ask away," I said, bracing myself. Again, a long pause, then softly, "What's your name?" "What's my name? That's what you want to ask me?" "Yes, sir." He ventured, embarrassment creeping up in his cheeks. "In the circle I live in, you don't ask nobody his name." Suddenly, I flashed back to the slack-jawed stare we'd encountered on our first day at the mission. "You don't ask anybody their name." "Ron Hall," I blurted out, smiling. "Mr. Ron," Denver replied, translating plantation style. "Nope, just Ron." "Nope, it's Mr. Ron," he repeated firmly. "What's your wife's name?" "Deborah." "Miss Debbie," he said warmly. "I think she's an angel." "Me too," I said. "She just might be one." His obvious affection for her touched me, especially because he had never really acknowledged her. So Denver and Ron are having breakfast, and they finally get past the names, and they eat, and then Denver asks this poignant question. "What do you want from me?" A direct hit, I thought, and decided to give him a completely unvarnished answer. "I just want to be your friend." He raised his eyebrow in curious disbelief, and a long moment of silence stretched between us. "Let me think about it," he said finally. I didn't feel rejected, which surprised me. Then again, I had never formally asked anyone to be my friend. So the book moves forward with the relationship between the two of them, and then Denver needs to give an answer. So they have coffee again a couple weeks later, and this is my favorite. Denver looks at Ron and says, I heard that white folks go fishing. When they do something called catch and release. Catch and release? I nodded solemnly, suddenly nervous and curious at the same time. That really bothers me, Denver went on. I just can't figure it out, because when colored folks go fishing, we were really proud of what we catch, and we take time to show it off and make sure everybody will look at it. Then we eat what we catch. In other words, we use it to sustain us. Sustain being italicized. So it really bothers me that white folks would go to all the trouble to catch a fish, then when they done caught it, throw it back into the water. He paused for a minute, and the silence between us stretched a full minute. Did you hear what I said? I nodded, afraid to offend. Denver looked away, searching at the autumn sky, then looked back at me with a drill bit stare. So, Mr. Ron, it occurred to me, if you is fishing for a friend you just gonna catch and release, then I ain't got no desire to be your friend. The world seemed to halt in mid-stride and fall silent. But if you is looking for a real friend, then I'll be one forever. That is what this book is about. That paragraph or two sums up what Denver means about friendship, that it is not casual, that it is forever, and that you stick through in thick and thin, as the book shows. I love that passage. So the relationship between Ron and Denver moves forward, and with Debbie, and there's a wonderful, you sense the great wisdom of Denver. At one point in the book, I'm not even going to try to find it, there's a place where Denver is looking at Ron's key ring. And there's a bunch of keys on the ring. And Denver says to him, you own stuff for everything on that key ring? And Ron said, yep, guess I do. And he looked back at Ron and said, do you own it, or does it own you? That made me stop for a moment. I think that that's an example of the amazing wisdom of Denver Moore. One of the things that I didn't talk about that was early in the book was that Ron Hall had an affair early in his marriage. As I talked about, we see Debbie heading one way in her life, we see Ron heading another in his life, and he ends up having a short-term love affair with a woman, an art dealer in Los Angeles, I believe. He is devastated that he's done it. He goes and tells Debbie. Debbie gets very angry, needless to say, but then she asks for the phone number of the woman that he's had the affair with. And she calls her, and she says, I'm sorry this has happened, and I hope that you can move on and find a man as wonderful as my husband, which I think says a great deal about Debbie. But the linchpin of the book, the pivotal God changer, is in the middle of the book. Debbie is diagnosed with liver cancer. And it's devastating, of course, to Ron and to Debbie and to Denver. And Ron talks about the fact that he is going to dedicate the rest of his life, that he has taken advantage of her for 30 years, and he is going to dedicate the rest of his life and her life to her, to taking care of her, which the book shows that he actually does. As Debbie gets sicker and sicker, the book goes through, there's quite a bit. I won't take a lot of time going through the surgeries that she has, and suddenly there's great joy, there's no cancer, it's all gone. The family celebrates. They have 2 children, by the way, Carson, a son, and Reagan, a daughter. And the family rejoices, and then what happens? Several months later, an MRI shows it's back. And so they go through this for several years, on again, off again, on again, off again. And one of the things that they loved was Ron walked into Union Rescue Gospel Mission at one point and found all the people there praying for Debbie. And he was surprised. But he found that they loved her as much as he did, which I think is absolutely wonderful. There's quite a compelling moment in the book where Debbie, somewhat weak, decides, by George, she's getting out of bed and she's going to the mall like any good woman. She's going to the mall. So she gets dressed and she goes to the mall, and Ron's at home. And about an hour later, she arrives back and she's sobbing. She's sobbing. And Ron said, "What happened?" And she looked at him and she said, "Am I terminal? Am I terminal?" And he looked at her. He said, "What are you talking about? What happened?" And she was in the mall and she ran into a friend who told her she was so sorry to hear that she was terminal. Well, nobody had used those words with Debbie before. And she looked at Ron and she said, "Am I terminal?" And in his great wisdom that we also see through this book, he looked at her and said, "Debbie, we're all terminal," which I thought was a great response. But indeed, in the book, she became sicker and sicker. And there's a wonderful, let me get to this page, if I can. This is in the words of Denver with Debbie being sick. Faith, as Paul the Apostle, is the assurance of things hoped for. Sorry, this might be Ron. The conviction of things not seen. This is Ron. I clung to the faith like a ropeless climber to the sides of a cliff. Faith that the God who said he loved me would not rip my heart out, steal my wife and my children's mother. Maybe this sounds stupid, arrogant even, but with all the bad press he'd been getting, I felt now might be a good time for God to buff up his reputation with a miracle. And there's no miracle like good healing. We could go on Oprah and spread the news. So I told him so. Deborah and I would have loved to do nothing at this point, no chemo, no surgery, no experimental drugs. We knew and believed in the scripture, all good things for the good of those that wait on the Lord. Wait upon the Lord, be still and know that God is good. But I wasn't willing to sit and wait, and I don't think Deborah was either. So they continued to fight, and they continued to fight, and they continued to fight. Deborah becomes